I'm Alexander Hefner, your host on The Open Mind. When I worried to you in the audience that the American experiment was possibly on a tyrannical course reminiscent of Netflix's House of Cards, one of my guests assured me the president still doesn't kill people. This, of course, is not the moral bar to set in a free society. We ought to demand more from our elected officials than avoidance of criminality. When I think of that comment again, the president still doesn't kill people, I wonder how accurate it is. Maybe not intentionally, but isn't the president complicit in warmongering and his far-reaching detonation of intolerance and political violence? What we can say with confidence is that the president's firestorms of tweets have thankfully not evolved into retribution against political opponents and dissidents that has resulted specifically in killings. But that's not the case in Erdogan's Turkey, or most prominently in Putin's Russia, where assassinations, poisonings, and barbarism are a regular occurrence. Today we learn about what happens when an authoritarian executive goes unchecked with a leading Russia and KGB scholar, Dr. Amy Knight, author of the new book, Orders to Kill: The Putin Regime and Political Murder, out by St. Martin's Books, in which she expertly chronicles the presumed crimes against humanity that Putin has committed and the impunity with which he escapes the legal system, unscathed, Amy, for now, and more popular than ever, no?
Yes, absolutely. His ratings are about 85% in the polls.
Are those independently verified, though?
Well, that's kind of difficult to say. The whole polling method in Russia is a little bit complicated. But basically, they do reflect, I believe, a popular support for President Putin. Mainly, it's because the media is largely controlled by the state. And so therefore, Russian people are fed a constant stream of propaganda that glorifies Putin and that appeals to their sense of nationalism and patriotism.
Given what you establish in this book as a track record of alleged homicide, murder against journalists and political opponents, does Putin have anything to fear right now?
Well, yes and no. I think that in the longer term, support is eroding. Support for Putin is eroding. We had quite a few demonstrations, street protests just this spring, and a surprising number of young people came out protesting against Putin. So they're motivated, the protests are motivated primarily by, I think, economic concerns, but also there's been an increasing amount of publicity about the widespread corruption at the very top in the Kremlin, even including Dmitry Medvedev, the prime minister. He's implicated in really vast corruption. So I think that gradually people are beginning to ask themselves why it is that their standards of living are declining, which they are. The Russian economy is still way behind what it was a few years ago. Why their standards of living are declining, and yet the people at the top, the oligarchs, the top government officials, have dachas, they go skiing in fancy places, they lead the lifestyle of very, very wealthy men. So that discrepancy, I think, is a potentially disruptive force.
So inequity is the major disconnect. You also mentioned political corruption. What is more alarming, do you think, to the Russian citizen right now? The economic situation, the political corruption, or do you think this string over a decade plus, 2 decades of killings and a chilling effect are beginning to resonate? Is it all of the above?
Well, I would say that the killings and the murders that I talk about in my book have had a chilling effect on the democratic opposition and on the Russian independent journalists. So it's yes, it's very frightening to these people, and they are all aware, including Alexei Navalny, who is declared himself a potential candidate for the presidency. This is something that really casts a shadow over opposition movements. But as for the general population, I'm sorry to say that no, they don't really know very much about these murders. They may know that they've happened, but it's too far removed. And their concerns are definitely the economic concerns. And the fact, well, this goes hand in hand, not only is the economy in decline, but the infrastructure of the economy is really crumbling. So, and that, by the way, was what helped the demise of the Soviet Union. So this is something that the broad segment of the population is really concerned about.
I want to ask you to what you attribute the tolerance of these murders, but you really spelled it out just now, which is a lack of awareness in the first place in a state media-dominated culture. But you dedicate this book, you were telling me just now, to the widow of one of the targets, one of those who were assassinated under this regime. Can you tell us who he was and what your relationship is with his widow?
Alexander Litvinenko he worked for both the KGB and then later the KGB's successor organization, the FSB. And he was involved in, well, anti-corruption cases and quite a few cases that involved high politics and the mafia when he worked for the FSB. So Litvinenko, finally, he decided at one point that he was being uncomfortable. He was uncomfortable with the modus operandi of the FSB, and he and some colleagues were actually asked to assassinate Boris Berezovsky, who was a well-known oligarch. And this was at a time in the 90s when there were just all sorts of mafia figures and shootings. It was a pretty violent dog-eat-dog world. Anyway, Litvinenko was not happy about this, and he told Berezovsky about it. And then he and some of his colleagues actually had a televised press conference in 1998 when they revealed this plot. The head of the FSB, and Mr. Putin, was not happy about this. And so Litvinenko was imprisoned twice. And then finally he decided to defect because he knew that his life was in danger. So he defected with his wife Marina and his young son Anatoly, and they ended up in London.
Keep telling the story.
Well, so Litvinenko underwent a sea change. Instead of working for the security organs, he became their greatest enemy. And he had a particular animosity towards Vladimir Putin. So he basically set out, after he moved to London in 2000, he set out to just campaign against Putin and expose everything about him, his dictatorial methods, his corruption, the role that Putin and the FSB might or might not have had in the 1999 September apartment bombings in Russia. So Litvinenko became I would say, one of Putin's main detractors from abroad. And he also became very close with Boris Berezovsky, who also was forced to flee Russia for his own safety, and also ended up in London. So the two of them, surrounded by a coterie of immigrants from Georgia, from Russia itself, etc., they formed this kind of clique that basically was devoted to undermining Putin and hopefully deposing him.
But that did not happen.
No. It did not happen.
Ultimately, they met their demise, as a lot of defectors and now political opponents do. What I'm wondering from your perspective, it seems as though the defectors have only had the effect of further emboldening Putin. Why have we not seen the level of prosecution or evidence to substantiate it in the court of public opinion so that there's some international body that could then intervene?
Well, in the case of Litvinenko specifically, as you know, it was pretty much proven by a British High Court that conducted an inquiry into the Litvinenko murder in November 2006. It was established that the killers were two Russian men, one of whom, well, both of whom were contracted by the FSB, and we know for a fact that they actually administered poison to Litvinenko, polonium, a very deadly poison, I might add. They went back to Russia, these two men, Lugovoy and Kovtun, and Lugovoy became a deputy to the Duma. He is very popular. Everybody in Russia knows that he and Kovtun actually murdered Litvinenko, and people have pretty much praised them for that because they considered Litvinenko a traitor.
These incidents have only further emboldened Putin and not provided any formula for how to take him down.
Well, I think that definitely, I'll mention the most recent example would be Boris Nemtsov, a leading Democratic opposition politician who was gunned down just outside Kremlin walls in February 2015. Now, Nemtsov, it's very interesting. He was quite a popular politician, very charismatic, and as I point out in my book, he was kind of the complete opposite of Putin. He was tall and swarthy, very good-looking, a ladies' man, and completely charming. He was also very courageous, extremely courageous, and he became one of Putin's greatest critics. Now, I think, in my opinion, why Nemtsov was singled out. I don't think that at the time he was really a political threat to Putin in the sense that he might, contest the presidency or something like that in the future. No, Nemtsov didn't have that broad political support that would have been a threat. But Nemtsov went to Washington and he talked about Putin. He tried to get U.S. lawmakers to increase the sanctions against Russian officials who were corrupt and who violated human rights. Now, this was, again, we're talking about treasonous behavior in terms of maybe it's okay to voice your opposition to Putin on a Russian television program or to organize some people on the streets. But going to Washington and really trying to get U.S. lawmakers to increase sanctions against Russian leaders or Russian officials, that was not good.
Well, that tested the extent of his dissent that was allowable, and off with his head. Are there potentially security organizations, international bodies that in a third Putin term would have some jurisdiction, have some potential to bring justice? Your book is justice for victims, but beyond the truthful and accurate chronicling of the murders, what is the recourse right now?
You know, I regret to say that there's very little recourse. I mean, we've got the European Court for Human Rights, and Russians, dissidents, oppositionists have appealed to the European Court, but they don't really have much sway as to what's going on in Russia. And you know, a good example of this would be the murder of Paul Klebnikov in Moscow in July 2004. His family, his wife Musa and his brother Peter, have sought ever since, for years, to really get to the bottom of the case and to find out who ordered the killing of Paul Klebnikov, who was a journalist, I should add. He was the editor of Russia's Forbes magazine. And the Russian authorities, the prosecutors and the investigators, so on and so forth, have come up with the people who actually pulled the trigger and shot Paul Klebnikov. But they've never been able to find out who orchestrated the murder. And this has been hugely frustrating for his family. They've appealed to Putin directly, and Putin promised at one point that he would solve the case. They're never solved. There's a typical pattern. They usually find the people who've actually carried out the murders, but they're never able to find the people who ordered the murders, the zakazchiki, as we say in Russia.
They are proud of the way in which they're able to undertake these assignments without declaration before or after.
Well, yes, and now it's interesting. I talk in my book about Ramzan Kadyrov, who is the president of Chechnya. And there are several Chechens have been implicated in murders. This is kind of the standard thing. Blame it on the Chechens. But in several cases, this is true. Kadyrov himself has been implicated, particularly in the Nemtsov murder, because he hated Boris Nemtsov. Nemtsov was very critical of Kadyrov, who, by the way, is a dictator in his own republic, Chechnya, a ruthless, ruthless man. And so, interestingly enough, he actually has been implicated, but never to the point of being tried. And there's a complicated relationship between Putin and Kadyrov, because Putin and his fellow Kremlin leaders rely on Kadyrov to maintain stability in Chechnya, which was for a long time really a hotbed of radicalism and separatism. But in exchange, they have to give Kadyrov carte blanche to rule the republic the way he wants to. And as part of this agreement, it seems that Kadyrov has at times organized the hitmen in some of these murders.
As you think of America today, not as an antagonist, at least in the executive branch of Russia, in fact, thanking Russia for ejecting American diplomats, whether it was sarcastic or not, we don't know President Trump's true relationship, and we don't know his true financial relationship with Russia. But how do you think, first of all, what do you think will ultimately be revealed with respect to Trump's connection to Russia?
This is very difficult to say, but I think that probably we're going to find out that these connections ran pretty deep. I don't know that we're going to trace it directly to Trump or Trump's children, but I think just judging from such cases as that of Paul Manafort, his former campaign manager, and some of the other people, well, Michael Flynn, they at best were very injudicious and very uncautious in their dealings with Russia. They didn't seem to know who these people were that they were meeting in various times in 2016. So I do think more is going to come out, and I think that eventually, whether it leads to actual collusion that Trump himself knew about, I think it's going to continue to raise questions about the judgment of him and the people that surround him regarding Russia.
And what about this idea that he is, as Hillary Clinton said, a puppet, that he has financial stake in Russia, that his business and now his presidency is dependent upon in some ways normalizing relations with Russia and in some ways tolerating the political murders?
I'm not sure. I wouldn't want to venture speculation on the extent of which Trump has some sort of financial concerns that would lead him to be so favorable to President Putin.
But as has been pointed out, he could not have responded to the ejection of American diplomats in any way that was more prostituting himself to Putin.
Oh, yes, I totally agree with that. I think it's just absolutely disgraceful how he has pandered, how President Trump has pandered to Vladimir
And you wonder
Putin.
why, right? Why do you think?
Well, I don't know if you, there was this report by Christopher Steele, this
Right.
MI6, former MI6 agent, and he basically did, in this dossier that he wrote, he did tie together a lot of Trump people with the Russians and efforts to influence the campaign.
And it
Now,
didn't have the substantiation, so it was discredited.
It
And
was
the American
discredited,
media,
but not completely. And I think we're still waiting to see if some of those, if some of the things that Steele said in this very, very damning dossier, if even half of it is true, then this could harm President Trump. Now, that's one possibility, that he's worried that the Russians might in some way blackmail him. But I think the other thing is that he and President Putin have kind of a natural affinity towards each other. It's very strange. President Trump has said more than once that he admires Putin because he's a strong leader who puts his country first. And Trump doesn't seem to look beyond that. He basically, I think, genuinely respects Vladimir Putin to the point where he's willing to overlook the fact that Putin commits murders of his own people.
how do you think the discovery of Trump's collusion would further or not further Putin's goals?
I do not think that Vladimir Putin is anxious to have any collusion between Russians and Trump officials. I think that would go counter to anything that Putin and his colleagues in the Kremlin would wish.
Has he responded to that accusation in the same way he does to the political murders? You saw him interviewed at a hockey rink, and he's toying with the reporters about the collusion. Is that the way he also responds to the insinuation that he is involved in any of these assassinations?
Well, Vladimir Putin hasn't really been confronted by members of his own media and others about these assassinations. Every once in a while, something comes up. But as far as Trump is concerned, I really do believe that it is not in Russia's interest to have the collusion or the possible collusion between the Russians and Trump brought out.
We know Putin is power hungry. Why doesn't he take his chips off the table for this third election? Because he believes that he's invincible? What further does he want to personally gain from being president or prime minister or having a role in leadership? What are his considerations besides power? Or is that the only one?
I think that there are two considerations. One is that, yes, Vladimir Putin is addicted to power, and in a very serious way, and he has his own self-image. It's very much like Stalin never wanting to give up the reins of power in the Kremlin. But also, if Vladimir Putin stepped down and there was a reshuffle at the top, then Putin would no longer be in the situation where he could control all of the information about the extensive corruption, including his own. So he would be making himself vulnerable, because he can never trust the next leadership in the Kremlin to make sure that his corrupt activities will not, and murders, will not be revealed.
Well, as we face our own frightening realities here in the U.S., I think that you enhance our perspective and give us so much depth on Putin. Thank you, Amy.
Thank you.
And thanks to you in the audience. I hope you join us again next time for a thoughtful excursion into the world of ideas. Until then, keep an open mind. Please visit the Open Mind website at 13.org/openmind to view this program online or to access over 1,500 other interviews. And do check us out on Twitter and Facebook at Open Mind TV for updates on future programming.
Continuing production of The Open Mind has been made possible by grants from Ann Olnick, Joan Gans Cooney, the Engelson Family Foundation, Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation, Joanne and Kenneth Wellner Foundation, and to the corporate community Mutual of America.